My name is Ryan Pack.
And I'm Nicole Barlow.
And this is Soundtrack Your Life, where we speak with a guest about a soundtrack that is important to them. Our guests today are Jen and Sarah. They host the Movies and Us podcast. So welcome, Jen and Sarah.
Hello, hello. We are so excited to be here and to get to talk about this movie with y'all and the soundtrack. I think this is a really special one, so I'm excited to dive in. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. This is going to be so fun. This is such a gem of a movie, so this should be a great time.
So before we dive into the movie, why don't you tell our listeners about Movies and Us?
Yeah, so Movies and Us, we started the podcast what feels like so many years ago. I think we're at like 6 or 7 years of podcasting together, Sarah and I, and it's a weekly gathering place filled with conversation about movie stories and connection. We take a film each week and really dive into our thoughts, reactions, things that stood out to us, and some of the areas that we're really captivated by is how so many of the films are representative and reflective of the things that are happening around us in our culture and society, and for the unique people groups that they represent, and also a place for us to experience joy and entertainment and emotion in really deep ways. So lots that we talk about with the storytelling and films and how they connect to all of us.
Yeah, very cool. And you picked a really interesting film and soundtrack to talk about today. We're going to talk about the 2017 Kogonada film Columbus. And this is not about Christopher Columbus. This is not about Columbus, Ohio, but it is a movie about Columbus, Indiana.
So if you're Googling this, it's a real ride.
Yeah.
Columbus 2017, in parentheses, what you're going to want to Google.
Yes. So, Jen and Sarah, why did you pick Columbus for us to talk about today?
I mean, I've loved this movie for years. I think I watched it in 2017 or 2018, and I've been trying to evangelize Columbus just as much as I can. And so this is just one that not a lot of people have seen, but there's so much depth here. And then the soundtrack is so important to this film. The film is very, very quiet and there's a lot of silence in it. And so in the moments when the soundtrack comes in, I think are really, really powerful. So I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion, both about the film and the soundtrack and its use of sound throughout.
Yeah, so the film is scored by a band out of Nashville called Hammock. And they're kind of like an ambient indie sort of band. Hammock is a good band name for them because it does kind of relax you.
Yeah.
The score does kind of remind me of a score that we recently covered with the We Live in Time score, which was done by Bryce Dessner of the National. A little, obviously, more ambient, but there are similarities, I feel like. So beautiful score, very thoughtfully titled tracks. They're all named after architects. While Bryce Dessner just named his tracks after things that were happening in the movie, like Bouncing Ball or Weetabix.
Right. Here you get, more of like an IMA reference. But you're right. It's a very interesting score in that it is incredibly ambient to the point where you almost don't even notice it, at least if you're me. I think it's so subtle, but then you listen to it independent of the movie and it is like really beautiful and layered and considered. I had read a thing that, the director read an interview with Hammock, and in the interview, they're talking about this relationship between absence and presence. And I feel like that is what clicked for him is, oh yeah, he's got to be part of this film because that's a lot of what this deals with, both in architecture and in the relationships in this movie. Jen, do you have the same kind of evangelistic attitude towards Columbus? Is this your film that you tell people about? What's your relationship to the film?
Was lucky to be on the receiving end of, it was probably patient zero.
Yeah, I think so.
From Sarah. Yeah, she had seen this film and absolutely loved it. And we got to review it on the podcast. And it was one of my favorite conversations that we had from that year. And I think Koganada in general is really fascinating. So putting Columbus in conversation with some of his other films and some of the themes that he seems so captivated by is really interesting. And there's such a humanity to his films while also being incredibly philosophical at the same time. And it invites you to do the work and to go deep and to be meditative. And that's really refreshing in like a really fast-paced modern society that we live in right now. So this is just such a breath of fresh air. I think everyone should probably watch it so they can come and be still with themselves and with each other. Yeah.
Mm, I like that. Be
Yeah.
still, yeah, is this sort it seems like a dominant theme of the film too. It's very
Mhm.
slow. Like the pacing of it is very slow, which you kind of have to give yourself over
Mhm.
to. It's not something that's going to give you all the answers. It's not rapid. It's very languid.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally agree. I think anyone that feels like this film is too slow, this film is probably for them. So yeah,
Yes,
yeah, it's really beautiful.
probably.
It's it was fascinating to watch this film. I think we've probably reviewed and watched this film at least like 3 or 4 times at this point with different folks and amongst ourselves. And it was so interesting to watch this film through the lens specifically of the score because I was like you, Nicole, it's so seamlessly woven into the fabric of the film that I didn't particularly note it the first time, but seeing when the score comes in and the moments it chooses to come in at was really interesting. I think there's like a whole narrative arc around each of those moments as vignettes, and if you string them together, there's kind of the significance for when the score comes in. So I'm excited to talk about that with y'all.
The score is broken up into a handful of tracks, and like you said, it doesn't cover like the entire film. It picks and chooses its spots. And as far as songs that are in the movie that are not on the score, there is one specific song called "Eat the Night" by the Ets or the Eats. And
Yeah, wasn't
and
sure
when
how.
that song shows up in the movie, I guess we're kind of spoiling things here. Like it really makes its presence because you're used to kind of this score that you can that kind of blends in, and then all of a sudden you have this diegetic track that is just blasting from this car stereo, and it really kind of shocks you the way that it's used in the movie.
Yeah, and that moment is so shocking too. I love how the score is interwoven into the film to really help you kind of understand what the characters are feeling in any given point. And I feel like at that moment, Casey is just, man, she's having a hard time. And she has this like frenetic energy inside of her that she needs to release in some way. She's going to do something. And so that abruptness, I think, just perfectly matches what she's feeling inside too, because we've seen her pretty steady throughout the film, even in difficult moments, but at that point she just, man, she just needs a release. So that jarring, I think, is so effective in that moment.
It's very jarring, and it's very rare that you see on screen just kind of a garden variety indie
Mm-hmm.
rock track that might be used for some kind of dance breakdown scene drop in this way. Because when I got to this point, the movie is so slow and quiet, and there are many parts that don't really contain any scoring, they don't contain any diegetic music, like nothing's really there except for, these leaves rustling and these buildings that it's very sparse, right? And so you get to this scene and this one track, it's like it just sort of hits you like a bomb. It's very aggressive. And this is like, again, spoiler alerts, but the character of Casey, Haley Lou Richardson's character, finds out this really terrible secret of her mother's, and this thing that she's been suspecting is true. And you do kind of see it play into this like breakdown in a way that feels very, very real. It's a very get real moment for the movie and stands kind of separate from that beautiful ambient score of Hammocks.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny but also terrifying moment.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, because she's not dancing like it's fun, I'm having a great time. She's having like a
Mm-hmm.
crisis. It's crisis dancing.
And what makes that scene really great too is I think throughout the film up until that point, the actors do such an incredible job of cluing you into there being so much more brimming beneath the surface in them than what is outwardly expressed. So they are incredibly calm and still and have these quiet conversations. But both John Cho and Haley Richardson have these small facial expressions and moments where you can feel that there's such a tidal wave of emotion that's brewing. It's just not expressed explicitly and outwardly and boldly. And so there's a feeling of catharsis to see them be able to finally let so much of that emotion that's been stewing in them, that they've been holding together, finally be released in this way. And it's almost begging to overflow. And so I think the tension and the build up of those characters and the way that they're portrayed on screen also helps that moment feel really big and meaningful. And I think the pacing of it and when it comes in the film is really important too. So we've built the trust, we've seen them have many conversations leading up till that point, and finally there's just this thing that they can share together.
Yeah, and throughout the film, the way that a lot of these scenes are shot, there's kind of like a voyeuristic sort of kind of see it through a voyeuristic lens, like you're literally like a fly on the wall watching people talk. Like it's not a lot of, shot reverse shot. It's a lot of these long conversations, very deep focus, and sometimes like behind an object, so it looks like you're kind of spying on them. And I think that just kind of adds to like the intimacy of this movie, that you're just watching these people have like these very real conversations.
For sure. It's a very intimate movie. There's a very uncomfortable scene in a bedroom with Parker Posey's character and John Cho's character that's shot in that way, where you see them through this set of mirrors. And it feels very much like you're spying on something that you shouldn't see and probably don't really want to be seeing, because the interaction pans out very awkward.
And I love that scene. I it's very uncomfortable, but it's so beautifully shot. And I love that. And you see this all throughout the film. The camera is just still. And so you're watching the actors move around in the frame, and the actors create the movement rather than the camera creating that sense of movement. And I just love that choice of the camera being so intentionally still throughout. And to go back to what you guys were saying earlier, like it forces me to also be still and like feel like, oh, I need to like slow down and like settle in, because there's not a lot of movement. There's not a lot of rushing around. And then those moments when the camera does move, there are a few times where you see like a pan from the camera. It's like, oh, we're doing something different now. Like, why are we panning the camera? Let's think about this a little differently. So I love all of those little aesthetic choices that Kogonada makes throughout the film. And I think they all have such interesting meaning, or at least something to think about.
So I know of his work because, he's also done After Gang. He's also done some episodes of The Acolyte for Star Wars for Disney Plus. But he started as a video essayist. And I don't think I know of too many directors who have found their way into Hollywood through video essays.
Yeah, that's an interesting career trajectory. I didn't know that about him until I started researching for this film, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, good for you. You should write some kind of tutorial on how that happens. I'm sure being very talented
Yes.
helps, but that is quite a leap to make.
But I think you can see his understanding of like film theory and, a lot of the directors that he admires. You can see that in how he shoots things. I think there's, an admiration for like Wong Kar-wai, and I think also there's some Richard Linklater in here as well. I mean, you could, name Wes Anderson. I think, with how detailed every shot is, like, I think there's a lot as, a person with like a film background where you can really like chew on it.
Yeah, visually, there's so much to think about and so much that lingered with me after watching it. It's so immaculately framed, and there are aspects of it that the way that they are filmed, or like these post-its in that one office building that are all just kind of like these like modernist paintings, like perfectly like lined up in primary colors, is like haunting me. I'm haunted by these post-its. Everything is very architectural, I suppose, like in its approach, which makes sense for a movie that is in its way about architecture. Are either of you architecture buffs or fans, like prior to this movie, or you're like, yeah, I am Pays my jam? Some people are, so I have to ask.
I am personally not. One of my good friends is an architect, and so traveling with her is incredibly fascinating to see like the way that her eye takes in visual and space creation. So I feel like secondhand absorbed just a lot of hearing her talk about her craft and kind of the balance of art and science together that's inherent in architecture is really fascinating too. And so it's so interdisciplinary. And so I think that it's interesting to see the way that Kogonada also constructs these like incredibly philosophical arguments, but is incredibly artistic in the way that he brings that to life in this film. So seeing that balance of his brain, kind of logically constructing these theses, but then also expressing them so emotionally is interesting. Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say that I am an architecture buff, but I do enjoy looking at buildings. um, and just I think that there's and it's a through line in this film is trying to see beauty in the mundane. And so I think that's kind of the lens that I come at it from. But sometimes, especially if I'm in, not my normal city, I'll see a building and I'll just be like, man, I just need to look at this for a little bit, just because there you can find beauty in buildings, which I think is just wild. But yeah, so I wouldn't go as far to say a buff, but I do enjoy beautiful buildings. So all the architecture in this film, I'm like, yes, let's go. I'm ready to look at these weird buildings.
No, architecture. I think this is a very funny movie to discuss, as The Brutalist is in the conversation now for the Oscars, and maybe it's like the season of good movies about architecture.
Man.
No, maybe that's rounding the corner. It's interesting because John Cho's character starts the movie with my father is this renowned architectural scholar, and because of that, my relationship with architecture is I kind of fucking hate it because it's ruined my life, and my cold and distant dad has chosen that over a relationship with me. And you kind of see him become more open to that beauty in the mundane, or that beauty that maybe he has missed because of this closed off relationship with his father. Haley Lou Richardson's character kind of brings him new appreciation for these things around him, and and he eventually decides to stay and be with his dad and kind of figure all of this out. But I think that's interesting because it's not quite like a tour guide thing, as he calls for in the movie. Like, he pokes fun at it almost in the movie in like this meta way. Like, you're being a tour guide about it. Like, what do you really feel about these buildings? And the way that it's shot and the way that the music, I think, supports that idea of space and of relationships, it does kind of give you like a moment to just reflect on it, and how some of these things that seem like these bank buildings made of glass seem really like pedestrian now. We're like very radical at one point. I don't know. It was very eye-opening for me. I did kind of get down with some of the more architecture-related themes.
That scene is one of my favorites in the film. His "What Moves You About This Building," and I think the way that the score highlights and emphasizes and actually draws out the meaning of that scene is really beautiful. So he asks her, and then we don't get to hear it. Cuts out the dialogue, and the score comes rushing in, and it's these beautiful meditative chords that are magical. But what's really great about the way the score really highlights the feeling of that scene is that there's a connection that's forming between them. There's an intimacy that's forming between them that the score is augmenting. And because he's asking her essentially what moves her heart. He wants to know her soul. He wants to know her emotion. He wants to know her mind. He's not here for the facts that she's rattling off. And so he's kind of pursuing a second layer, third layer of who she is as a person. And so I thought that really was beautiful, the way that the score emphasizes this deep human connection that is beginning to open up between the two of them. And we don't get to hear. We just have to focus on these two characters and the chemistry between them and the connection between them. It's not important what moves her. It's important that we see that he is exploring and understanding her mind, and she is feeling seen. She is feeling known in that. And so I love that's one of my favorite moments, and I think it's where the score is like really shining in the way that it highlights some of the emotional beats of this movie.
Yeah, you had mentioned, Jen, there are some other moments. That's one for me too, where I really did notice the score for maybe the first time, and I'm like, oh, this is beautiful. Are there other moments in the film for both of you where you're just sort of like, okay, the score here really feels like it's creating the mood of the movie.
Yeah, I feel like what I found really interesting upon this rewatch is how the score comes in a lot of times when people aren't talking. And so it's almost like there's a conversation that happens, and the conversation kind of ends, and then the score comes in to kind of fuel that emotion and like move you to the next scene, the next vignette where we're going to explore something else. And so I thought that was a really interesting way to help infuse emotion into some scenes where no words are being spoken, but this music just helps you come in and feel something that these characters are feeling. And I don't know, that's just kind of a different way to use a score. I feel like a lot of times it'll like undergird conversations and will take you places, but I feel like in this film a lot of the conversations happen in silence, and then the music comes in when nobody is speaking. And I appreciate the way that the film plays with silence and sound, and I think that those are some really interesting strategic choices it makes.
Yeah, I mean, with the amount of detail in every shot and every amount of, detail in the facial expressions, like I feel like it would be almost too much if you had the music going on at the same time as conversation, as well as, just like these gorgeous, like very deep shots where, you can see like 4 or 5 rooms behind them. It's just such a, it's a movie about space, right? Like space is
Mhm.
such a huge theme of this movie, whether it's visually or auditory, right? It's such a huge part of this. And and I guess metaphorically, right? Like there's a lot of space as far as like emotional space. Like he feels very distant from his father. She is maybe not allowing herself to have space from her mother, right? There's this kind of push and pull, and it's pretty cool how all of it kind of combines into this, like the film's very effective that way.
Yeah, and it is, as you said, a smart and strategic choice to do exactly that with the score, to place it in areas where maybe you wouldn't normally have scoring. But I think also just the idea of choosing this kind of lesser known, indie ambient duo to the entire thing is not something every director would choose, right? They could have very easily said, like, no, we'd like something more lush or orchestral, but that would kind of, I think, like choke out a lot of the emotional, I think, heft of this film, and a lot of that stillness would start to kind of, I don't know, get crowded. So there's definitely, you have to respect how deliberate this movie is. It's very deliberate in everything that it does, and it feels like a very, tight thesis. What it wants to say, it says it, I think, in a very perfect way, a perfect package.
Yeah, can you imagine you're directing your first feature film, and you're like, for the soundtrack I want to pick this band that has never done a movie before.
Right. And the studios are like, who? What? Hammock has done, I think, a little bit more, at least like given more of their songs to commercial work. I think there's a Ricky Gervais show on Netflix that they lended some music to, and you'll have to forgive me the name I've forgotten, but I would love to see their work pop up in more things. I feel like it actually is really appropriate for scoring. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and obviously music is very important to Kogonada. When he did After Yang, he got Ryuichi Sakamoto, who's like a legend in scoring. So it's not like, he's like, "Oh, I need to save money here, so let's go get some unknowns." Like sound is also very important. I know he's known to be a visual guy because of his video essays, but clearly he's like very deliberate about everything that he does.
It was fascinating to listen to some of Hammock's other work that wasn't scored specifically for film. And I just was curious about the way that Kogonada, like broad swath as he's researching and looking in the market and exploring what he's looking for, just how much feels very resonant with Columbus and the themes of Columbus in some of the previous work and future work after Columbus was released. It feels all very coherent in the way that Hammock's style is incredibly meditative and ambient, and yet so deeply emotional. I think sometimes ambient music can feel like it's creating a sensation, but his is sensation plus emotion, and I think that's challenging to do, and he somehow is able to nail it. And so seeing that, just was imagining Kogonada discovering and really like feeling like, this is what my film's experience emotionally should feel like. So I thought that was fascinating to see just some of his other work.
Sensation plus emotion. That's such a great way to put it. I love that phrasing.
I think one of the things that I noticed this time about the score is that it sometimes sounds organic, and I think it's a really beautiful pairing with the film, because you're constantly seeing these shots of architecture and these man-made things, but there's usually something natural or organic in the frame as well. So like they're having this conversation in the library and the dude is like watering plants behind them, or they're having the conversation about the bridge and they're in a field. And so I love visually we get that juxtaposition of buildings, and it's this very modern style, but we haven't forgotten the earth and the nature around it. And I feel like the score really complements that, because sometimes the score it will sound like it's wind or something, but that it's instruments that are creating this. And so I thought that was a really beautiful pairing. And to your point, Jen, like, wow, how do you do that? I don't know.
How do you do that? I think ambient music gets overlooked a lot of the time because it's not, anything instrumental is automatically going to take a backseat to things that are lyrical. But I think they do such a beautiful job of making those bridges and those connections. And it's interesting the choices they make in parts of the score too. Like you said, there's a lot of it that's very like naturalistic and feels very free flowing, very meditative, very like I'm listening to my yoga mix. And then they'll insert something that feels a little bit mechanical, like there'll be a little bit of static, or there'll be something dropping in that feels almost like interruptive, like it's something on the landscape, right? Or something like interrupting a conversation or a moment or something preventative. So it's not just this beautiful, peaceful, ambient score like you might in your head imagine it. It has some really interesting choices in it as well.
So it's not clear in the movie, but I'm wondering if John Cho's character, Jin, I'm wondering if there is a bit of like small town dismissiveness when he arrives in Columbus, and I think that is part of the reason why a lot of these shots show, um, like fields and vegetation. Like, I think he's a big city guy who's come to see his father, obviously reluctantly, right? There's been issues between the two, and he obviously wants to get out of there as soon as he can. And I feel like that is like Columbus is a character. I think Kogonada is very deliberate in making Columbus a character. And even though, we don't hear Jin talk about like, oh, I'm, back in Chicago or back in New York or Toronto or wherever he may be the rest of the year, clearly there's some sort of like also like resentment of like, why am I in this random city?
Yeah, this random city in like the Midwest that's all about architecture. Like, what?
And it's weird, right? Because it's in reality, it's a place that has all these, modernist marvels that are on, registries of historical landmarks, right? But then it's also probably got like a Walmart superstore, and it's got the meth addicted mom, and it's not, maybe the nicest place to be when you get right down to it. When you get down to places that you want to live, it's probably not going to be like top 10. So it's a very odd juxtaposition, right? Like it's this weird Indiana town that also just happens to have this like wonderful architectural
It's not even
history.
the most famous Columbus in America. We're in the Midwest.
We're texting Ryan and I, and he's like, "We're in Ohio," and I'm like, "I think we're in Indiana." Like we had to look it up, right? Because I had never heard of Columbus, Indiana, being not an architecture buff.
Yeah, I had to like go back and be like, oh yeah, Rory Culkin is talking about like Bloomington, and I'm like, that's Indiana.
Right. There's a lot of dissonance. It's like, okay, which Culkin? Right. Which state? Where are we?
Why are they having this conversation in different aisles of the library?
These are important questions, honestly.
Important questions. What's wrong with Rory Culkin in this film that she can't? Seems like a perfectly reasonable choice for somebody to date. It's very
we need a deep dive on Rory Culkin's backstory in this film. What did
Isn't
you
it
do?
incredibly sweet when he's like, "Oh, actually, I don't smoke. I just like hanging out here with you."
Hang out with you, which is such a sweet, tiny moment. There's a lot of backstory that kind of remains mysterious and unexplained. I'm always going to wonder why John Cho is such a dick through like various parts of this movie, and where his mom is. But that's okay. Movies don't have to give you all
Maybe
the
he's
answers.
a Disney
They're,
princess, just no mom.
It was kind of giving that. It was kind of giving like unexplained parental death.
I think, we solved it. Disney princess, done. Mystery solved.
Because if his mom was dead, then he would have talked about that Korean funeral different because he would have had to go for his mom.
True. Yeah.
Oh, that's a really great point. Haven't thought of
So
that.
mom either doesn't exist or she's not dead.
Mm-hmm.
But if she does exist, then she should be in Columbus. Because with Casey, I think you can read between the lines of dad's probably just not in the picture, right?
Mhm.
Mom has been in some bad relationships. That's kind of where the drug problem came from. So she's kind of bounced around a little bit. But with John Cho, with Jin, where's mom?
Jin is a mystery.
Yeah, why would you be friends with a girl who says, "Oh, you speak English" at the beginning of their friendship? For me, that's like an automatic, I don't think we're gonna be friends.
Their first interaction is so cringe.
Well.
Oh.
It's pretty bad. It also accelerates very quickly to like, we had this kind of like horrible cringe first interaction to like, now I'm going to show you all the architecture against your will.
It's midnight. Get in the car. We're going to go see some buildings. Also, a mystery in this movie is Parker Posey's Eleanor. Because she is like a surrogate mom to Jin, and also there's some like Oedipal stuff here.
Yes.
Very not. Yeah.
Like, I don't want to dive too deep into that part because it's very cringe, but with the little amount of screen time Parker Posey has, I feel like she is a big presence in this film. Very bad Korean at the beginning of the movie, but that's to be expected.
Ryan was very critical of Parker Posey's
because
Korean.
At first I was like, what is she saying? I was like, she's saying professor in Korean, but it also sounds like she's saying Jesus in Korean, which is weird. I was like, clearly she's not referring to him as like some religious figure, but
well, I mean, she's very devoted to this guy, so maybe there is a little religious devotion.
She's got a shrine in her.
Maybe he's just like, you know what? We're going to leave that open at that bad Korean. It kind of works.
I wonder how many like takes they went. Kogonada's like, no, you're not saying it right. And then at some point just been like, all right, that's fine.
We'll move on.
We'll make it work.
Right.
Not as good as Lupita Nyong'o in Black Panther, but she probably could afford more dialect coaches because she had Marvel money for that. Sorry.
No, you're good. I think that you're right that she does like use her time very well. I mean, Parker Posey usually does. She's so impactful in this, and when she almost like rushes, she's like a breeze going through the room almost, or maybe it's a tornado going through the room, but like when she has arrived, and she is, and I think she provides an interesting contrast with Jin and Casey, because they move a little bit more slowly. When they walk, it's like, we're just taking our time, moseying along, which is very much the vibe of the film. And then Parker Posey's character comes in, and it's like, woo, we have to speed walk. We are walking with purpose down this hallway. So I love that she has such a different presence and such a different vibe in this film. And like, oh, something else has entered into this equation. Something interesting is going to happen because Eleanor is now here.
Yeah, like even at the beginning where she's like chasing after Jin's dad, who you never like really see. And I think in the credits, he's just like some random guy, like he's not even Korean, like because you never really see him anyways. It's like basically just casting a stunt double. Like whatever. You're not gonna see the face. But you see him chase after him, and then she's on the phone, like she's very, very much business on the phone, and then he takes his umbrella and just like takes off, and she's just like, "Where'd he go?"
I love that she drops her bag immediately and it
Yes.
thuds. It's so dramatic. It's great. Drop and go.
Yeah, it's very much his handler,
Mm-hmm.
She's such an interesting foil, like you mentioned, Sarah, to Jin and Casey because she's so emotionally expressive, and they are both not.
Mhm.
And like efficiency of her emotions being able to be freely felt is something that they both struggle with. And as someone who's also not very emotionally efficient, I found that to be a really fascinating dynamic when Jin and Eleanor are sitting at the bar, and she is so clearly able to express and feel her tears and let them fall, and he's still in shock, processing, having to like figure out how he feels in this much more complicated relationship. And so I think that's really fascinating to see the way that she's feels the freedom to be able to share and express and be vulnerable in that way, and it comes much harder for the other two.
Yeah, I love the economy of that bar scene because this is really the first scene that we have with Parker Posey and with John Cho's characters, and you can see that she's going through it from the beginning because she's very close to his father and she's falling apart. She wants the check. She wants to bail out of the restaurant as soon as she can so she can go, collapse into her emotions. And he orders another beer. Like it's simultaneous to her asking for the check, right? So you can see that they're on like different planes when it comes to how they're processing.
Yeah, and because Kogonada is so like these details are so deliberate. When he gets that beer and there's like no foam on top, I'm like, oh, that's like a poorly poured beer. And it's because everything in this movie like looks so perfect, and I'm like, oh, they must have done many takes because there's like no foam on top of that beer.
Right. That's the real Columbus, Indiana. Like you're not getting foam on your beer in Columbus, Indiana.
Sorry, I'm very deliberate about how my beer should look when I order a beer.
Those are two things that upset him. Like, well, there's no foam
And Parker Posey's Korean.
on that pour. And Parker Posey's Korean sucks.
It's fair. They are fair complaints, and I'm sure because Koganada is so detailed, he would probably appreciate those complaints. They were probably deliberate, like you said.
He'd be like, yeah, that was like the 17th take, and
yeah, it was just for
I'm
you, Ryan.
so glad
just
you
for you.
noticed that. You are understanding pieces of this film to notice the details.
I mean, I came prepared. I mean, I love celebrating a good John Cho movie as much as anybody. So this is kind of a really obscure fact, but I think it's worth mentioning. So one of the producers of the film is Chris Weitz. Chris Weitz is known for, probably best known with his brother, for writing and directing the American Pie movies. But that is kind of where John Cho got his start in Hollywood. And for someone who has had such a like John Cho's not like one of the leads of the American Pie franchise, right? Like, but he and Chris Weitz have worked to get together like constantly over like the past 25 years. So it's like an interesting sort of like friendship or business partnership that has kind of evolved. So Chris Weitz would eventually go and do About a Boy, which John Cho was not in, but is a great movie. But then you would cast John Cho in like In Good Company with Dennis Quaid and Chris Topher Grace and Scarlett Johansson. And I believe they did a sitcom as well at one point in like the early 2000s when it was still like the WB. And so like he's kind of like been connected to John Cho, post American Pie for a while, and it was kind of funny for me to see his name in the credits as one of the producers. I'm not sure if I don't know, maybe Kogonada needed like someone to come in and help pay for John Cho's, you know, his rate. I don't know why he was brought in, but it was kind of cool to see that like they're still working together even on this very small, independent film that it's like, well, I'm doing this movie. You wanna jump on board as a producer? Like, oh sure. So there's an American Pie connection to this movie.
Who would have thought?
That is
Like,
I mean, who would have thought? Also, it's really great to see John Cho in a
Mhm.
dramatic role because I
Yeah.
think for those of us of a certain age, you associate him with the American Pie movies and with Harold and Kumar, and it's cool to see him in something that isn't comedic, and that's really quite a lot of range.
And
He's
for him to
very good
nail
in
it.
this.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he's very good in this.
yeah, it's fun to think about like where he shows up. Like even I was looking through his filmography after finishing Columbus, and there was a lot of like, wow, this is a
He's
wide
everywhere.
swath of
Yeah.
movies and TV shows, and then there's Columbus, and I'm so glad that he did do this movie because he was perfectly cast for this.
I also want to point out that I know this movie was made in 2017, but John Cho is currently 52 years old.
Yeah,
He
I'm
looks
shocked
amazing.
every time I see him in a thing, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he looks so good. You're in your 50s? I don't believe it.
Right, because there's obviously like there's a lot to be said about the age gap
Mhm.
in this. It's not a romantic film. Their connection isn't necessarily romantic, but she's made out to be what,
Mhm.
19
Yeah.
in the film. She's sort of fresh out of high school and in between college, and I think you're kind of left to guess at how old John Cho is. But because he looks so young, it's like I guess it's fine. I don't know. John Cho could be like 30. I don't know. Looks great.
Yeah, you're just supposed to kind of accept that he is like post grad school, like a good like 10 years plus older than her.
Yeah, they just don't give you a ton of detail on his age, his life, his sort of where he is in his career. You just know that he's kind of like, son from the big city that he has to come home to his like the hometown that he hates.
Well,
Which,
it's not
to your
even a
point, works
hometown, right?
visually. Yeah.
Hometown that he hates. Yeah.
I think if he looked older, this film would sit differently. You know?
Mhm.
So it's great that he's kind of mysterious, unplaceable age. We don't know. Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's
yeah,
great
works
casting.
well.
He's wonderful in
Yeah, his
it.
age is old enough.
Yeah.
Old
Old
enough.
enough and
Old
young
enough.
enough.
Yeah,
Old.
he's old enough
Yeah.
and young enough.
Yeah.
Oh man.
He's old enough where he's too old for her, but young enough where it's like not super creepy.
Mhm.
Hard thing to pull off. A lot of age gap dynamics in movies. Very hard to pull off that like, okay, there's an age gap, but it's not like fully
I just
creepy.
can't
Very
unsee it
difficult.
after I know or cognitively am processing it as the film's happening, and it just distracts from the whole movie. You're like, this is not okay.
Yes.
I know there's a really great connection,
Yeah,
but no,
the-
I reject this.
totally. The one that gets me is Keira Knightley being like 17 in the filming of Love Actually. I can never get that out of my head. I'm like, that's
Not great.
Not good.
you
Yep.
should not be married.
I get it. There's some movies that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so good. And then you go back and you rewatch it and you go, oh no, this was not the move.
This was not what I remember. That happens to me all the
Well, I
time.
mean, like I've been going back and watching like the Disney animated classics with my kids. And we watched Peter Pan. I was like, man, this is super racist. I used to love this movie.
Yeah.
I know. And people get all mad like when they have those, I think Disney Plus has like those with disclaimers
Yeah.
in front of some of their movies now that are like, hey, there's some depictions in here that we wouldn't do today. So just so you know, like you're gonna
Yeah, I
see
like
some
how the
stuff.
disclaimers say they're not okay now.
That's
and
true.
It wasn't okay back then.
Yeah.
That's pretty honest, actually. Go Disney, I suppose. Anyway, sorry. It's a digression. Back to
It
Columbus.
amazes me that this is kind of Haley Lou Richardson's breakout film. Like this is a lot of heavy lifting to do as an actor.
Yeah, so much really like rides on her shoulders, I mean, obviously like John Cho he does a lot in this film too, but I feel like for a lot of it, Casey is the emotional center of the film. She is the one who is, taking him on this architectural tour and dealing with this stuff with her mom and dealing with, okay, what do I do next? What do I go to school? Do I go to school? Do I pursue architecture? Do I get this library thing? What's going on with Rory Culkin? You know, like there's a lot going on with her and her emotional state. And to your point earlier, Jen, like you can see all of the emotions below the surface, but they don't always bubble up. And to do that is not an easy thing, and she handles it really beautifully. She is such an important anchor in this film, and she nails it.
And these are the kind of performances that I think are most impressive to me. I think they're the ones that are maybe not easily rewarded by the powers that be that hand out the awards. You know, this is not like a big splashy bold type of expressive performance, but I think these are the hardest ones to do when it is so slow and subtle and nuanced, and you don't have the big like screaming match or the big expressive like emotional breakdown, but she is experiencing all of that. It's just so contained, and so the amount of like control and restraint to not is really impressive, and I think important to her character. And I think it's also why her character in the film connects so much with Jin's character in the film, because they recognize that they both have so much brimming beneath the surface that isn't fully expressed and doesn't always have the place to be fully expressed. And so they're able to provide a little bit of that holding space, metaphorically thing that you were mentioning earlier, Ryan, of being able to do that for each other. So hard type of performance to do, but she does it well.
It's very hard, and you mentioned that, you know, it's not something that's often rewarded by, the awards folks, and I am kind of wondering why this was a movie that maybe got a little overlooked in 2017, because I feel like it's a little bit of a hidden gem, is it not? I'm curious if anybody has any theories about why people, have not seen this film, or is it just me? I don't know.
Well, I think one of the descriptions for IMDb, like they have, like category tags. I think one of it is just Asian male white woman relationship, and I'm like, that's not a very
Yeah.
good way to explain this film.
That's a category tag? No, it
That's what I
isn't.
saw on IMDb, and I was like,
Yikes.
that's
We shouldn't be doing that. That deserves a Disney
yeah,
Plus disclaimer.
architecture, Asian man, white woman relationship, Indiana city name and title, one word title.
Okay.
Not doing a lot of favors.
No.
So the promotion maybe was a problem.
And I
It's a hard
think
one
this
to promote
is
too.
a type of film that I think, especially here in America, people don't want to watch. Like, it's just, unless you're an artsy fartsy person, or unless you're like a real big like film buff, you know, some people probably would see this because John Cho is in it, but I don't think there's a lot of draw typically for a quiet, still, meditative film about, you know, just two people trying to figure out life. Like, that's not gonna bring in the masses, but I think it's definitely worth watching. But yeah, I think it's a hard one to market, and I don't think people are like, after a hard day at work, you're not gonna come home and put on Columbus. But yeah, I'm glad that it was made somehow. I don't know how it was made, but there's an audience for this, but it's just smaller.
Yeah, according to the internets, the budget for this was only 700K, which is virtually nothing. So it's definitely an indie, distributed by Sundance. So presumably once it left the festival circuit, maybe it just kind of left the consciousness because it is so difficult to market. But I can also see it having a pretty nice second life. And so if people are, talking about The Brutalist, if you are, interested in these themes, it feels like something that deserves maybe a little bit of a
You could watch
rediscovery.
this twice before The Brutalist hits the third act.
It's true.
The Brutalist is like 3.5 hours. Talking about being economical, you
Right?
can watch this movie twice.
Save yourself some time. Ruminate on Columbus a couple of times. Skip The Brutalist.
I mean, obviously, this movie does have fans. If he got to make a second film, and obviously after Yang, lots of people love that movie.
One of my favorite parts that I get so tickled by in this movie is Gabe's whole monologue that he gives around like attention and interest, and how it's not that we don't have attention, it's that we don't have interest, and are we losing interest in the things that matter. And it just feels like such a meta, like, commentary
Very
thesis jab
meta.
that Koganada is just like, let me just slip this in there.
And Casey's whole little aside about how she doesn't have a
Yes.
smartphone, she has a dumb phone, and she sort of points to Jen and says, like, smartphone, dumb person. So it does seem like he has a lot to say about, our attention spans. Attention span might be like another kind of like hidden talking point for this movie. Because you're totally right, Sarah. Like, unless you are maybe an architect, you don't really want to unwind to something this slow. Or if you do, you're going to unwind maybe a little bit too fully. And you will unwind all the way to sleep. If you're not like really locked in, I think, to what this movie is, if you're not giving yourself over to it, it's not the kind of movie you can watch with your phone on.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. Like, I really appreciate films like this because they make me uncomfortable, but I think a lot of people aren't seeking to be uncomfortable with the movies that they watch. And so it's just a little different than what a lot of people want. But man, if you are a fan of Kogonada, this is perfect. It has him written all over it.
Well, the movie does have a climax. I feel like the soundtrack doesn't really have a climax in the score. I think that's where they drop in that song "Eat the Night." So I feel like it's kind of similar, where like people are expecting like a bigger moment or more resolution, and like the music, you don't really get that. Is what's going to happen to the dad? What's going to happen to Casey? Those things are not really spelled out for you. Like, we know she's going to leave, but we don't know what that means. Like, her mom is clearly not doing well. His dad is clearly not doing well. Is he going to just get sick of Columbus and go back? He's on a month-to-month lease, but we don't know what that means.
I know. I told Ryan. I think I give him a month on the month-to-month lease. It seems as if some of this like decision making to stay, could be short-lived. But I guess that's part of, it's part of the beauty of film. It doesn't have to give you all of the answers. You don't need to know anything beyond this kind of tension-breaking moment of Casey needs to leave and Jen needs to stay, and that's where we arrive. That is kind of the conclusion.
And I love that this film is so narrow in scope. We don't have to know all of the answers. We don't need to know, what if Casey goes on to be a great architect or whatever. We know that they made this decision, and that was a form of growth for both of them. And that's it. That's all we get. And we can, imagine that they go on to live their lives in a certain way. But just this brief moment in time that we spend with them, and that's it.
Yeah, it's a little lost in translation in that way, not to compare two films that feel very different in a lot of other aspects, but it's very much like, okay, we're just going to encapsulate this one moment of time that two people have together where they've kind of helped each other reach a conclusion in their lives, in that like chapter of their lives, and then they part. And it's not necessarily like romantic, and it's not, anything that you can put like neatly in a genre box, which is maybe why it's so weirdly tagged on IMDb. Like, you can't market it as like a rom-com. You can't. I think I saw some language when you're searching around for it is like, oh, it's like a indie romance. Like, it's not. No, don't believe that, please. It is not that. It is not Garden State. Thank God.
Yeah, definitely not.
Yeah, I thought it was weird that there's like just no rating for the movie. It's not, rated R. It's just not rated.
Kind of fits.
Yeah, I kind of love that. They were just like, just take it as it is.
Just watch it.
Yeah, it exists. Here you go.
Draw your own conclusions. Your kids won't get through this. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I started the movie and my daughter woke up from a nap and walked in. She's like, "What are you watching?" I was like, "This is a very adult movie. It's a movie for grown-ups. Don't worry about it."
Sometimes I say that too, and I realize what I really mean is like, I'm sparing you because you will not understand this. This is not, you're not ready.
Yeah, there's just a lot of grown-ups talking in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Grown-ups talking.
Talking
It's
and then
grown-ups
not
talking the
talking.
movie.
Yes. And then looking at buildings.
Yeah.
And only like 2 of them, too.
Which kids love.
This isn't even like Oppenheimer, like many grown-ups talking in many rooms. Like, no, it's just 2. Just 2.
It's so true.
It's also
just
literally
two.
a lot of grown-ups talking in libraries and very quiet places.
Quiet talk.
Yeah, I think the majority of the budget probably got put into securing like some of these location permits, and that was sort of it.
And paying Parker Posey and John Cho.
Yeah.
True. Yeah.
That's where Chris Weitz' money went.
There you go.
But maybe they took scale, you don't know.
I would assume they would have had to. Not that I understand the film business at all, with how people get paid, but yeah, I mean it was really a fun watch, and like I said, you know, I feel like there's a lot of Wong Kar-wai with how he shot things. Like I have a film studies degree, so I was like, I'll get to dust off some, you know, it's like very deep focus shots. Yeah, and there's like I think a little bit of like that Linklater before sunset. Like let's just have 2 people like walk around a city and talk, and like that's the whole movie. So it was great. Like my brain was constantly just thinking of like oh, what does this remind me of? Or so in a way it was like not meditative, but it was definitely like stimulating in that way where because I'm like paying attention like so intently, you know, I was like, oh, like how did what like oh, that's interesting how he shot that. It reminds me of this film, or it reminds me of like this director. You know, I think there's like a little bit of Wes Anderson in there with like these very like meticulously like staged camera positions and stuff like that. Maybe not so much where it's like a storybook like perfectly symmetrical thing, but I was like, oh.
Well, in Casey's first like lines are about how this architect made sure that everything was asymmetrical yet balanced, and I love that. That's the one of the first things that we hear her say, and then you kind of see that all throughout the film, that even the way that certain shots are composed, they are sometimes asymmetrical but they're still balanced, and I love all of those little details that you see throughout, and the way that he, because there's so much really interesting architecture in this place, he uses those pieces of architecture in the frame too. And even I love all of the shots in the inn because he's so constrained to the architecture, and so you'll see walls and stuff blocking things, and I love all of those little intentional details. So it's not perfect like Wes Anderson, but you can feel that same level of detail and meticulousness in here.
That's the coolest shower I've ever seen.
Yo. I was distracted by that too.
It's pretty great.
Well, there's that shot where he's got his like 2 arms hanging on there, and I was just thinking of Da Vinci's sketches with like, I don't know what this means something. I'm sure it means something.
So if you are a independent filmmaker, find a beautiful city like Columbus that has a lot of cool buildings and just shoot everything there.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean it's insane how many like amazing, like every shot is very interesting in this movie. And it's like, how do you find all these locations? Like I know the buildings are cool, but like within these cool buildings you found you know, you found all these like amazing rooms having these conversations, and just like the colors and everything, even though it's like very naturalistic, like it's like, oh, the lighting is perfect everywhere.
It's visually very stimulating. It made me want to go there, and I have very little interest in architecture, but it piqued my interest. Or Indiana, for that matter. What's going to bring me there?
This movie. Maybe.
This movie. One building with like the 2 brick pillars that can't touch, which really like also stuck with me.
Yeah, I almost want to be like, what's your favorite building from the movie? Like it's that gorgeous of a film.
It really is, though, and there are buildings that you get to see multiple times, and I think there are maybe a couple that you only get to see in one scene, but they're all really compelling, and they're all shot in really compelling ways. So the angles at which, you're seeing them feel just really compelling and really like in tune with the themes of the film and with connection and space and, where you find space to resolve the things that you need to resolve and how art does that. And I don't know, it's a very interesting film. I think that it gives you a lot to think about, even if it's not a lot happens. So I think like if you were to make a counter argument about this film, people could probably argue nothing really happens in this. And it's true, not a lot happens in this film, but also everything happens in this film. It contains a lot for not having a lot of dialogue or a ton of story.
Now, it's funny because at the end, Parker Posey and John Cho are having that conversation like, oh, I've got this month-to-month Airbnb, and we never see the Airbnb. It's just kind of mentioned. But it's like, I don't want to see a movie that has this Airbnb in it. Like, you're out of the inn.
No.
I'm done.
I'm out.
Yeah.
I'm out. This Airbnb is not going to look amazing. I am paid did not build this Airbnb. He did not design this.
Started building. I don't think I need to see the Airbnb.
Yeah, we don't care what your month-to-month apartment looks like. Yeah.
There will be no sequel.
I would like a mini vlog series with Gabe though, just like him palling around town with like all of his philosophical like ramblings. I think that would be really fascinating. What is his
Yeah, a
life look
spin-off
like,
movie with Gabe would be good.
Right?
Agreed. What's he
He's
doing?
inviting himself over for dinner. That's what he's doing.
Missing every social cue.
I'm hanging out with my mom
learning
tonight. Can I come?
Learning emotional intelligence.
I guess in a way you could say that's like some academics. Because she's always poking fun at like how he has a master's degree and how it's worthless.
He has the worst master's degree.
One master's degree, no bitches.
Sucks to be a library science major.
Yes.
Poor guy.
I was into it. He's great though. I don't know. It's potentially I have terrible taste in men. But that's also like, I don't know, like I just didn't get it. I was like, he's great.
I know some library science majors that have master's degrees. They're all great.
Yeah.
But none of them live in Columbus, Indiana. Well, thank you, Jen and Sarah, for coming to our podcast and bringing us this film. So much fun to talk about Columbus.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's always a delight to get to see something that you haven't seen and discuss it with great people who are really smart and thoughtful about it. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And it was fun to think about this film in the context of the soundtrack too. That was just such a different way to experience this film. So yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, it was great. And yeah, this film was so fun to talk about because there's so many layers within the movie, the soundtrack just being one of many layers, and just kind of picking apart how they all kind of meld together to make something that I think is greater than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm. The Columbus evangelism continues, y'all. We are all on this team together now.
Put in the Criterion Collection.
Yes. There you go.
So where can people find Movies and Us?
Yeah, we're on a lot of the typical podcasting platforms. So on your Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all that goodness. We're also on the socials, on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at Movies and Us Pod. So come hang out, follow along. We'd love to connect with y'all. But thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously you can find us on the same socials. We're on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Instagram at SoundtrackCast. And obviously Blue Sky is what? SoundtrackCast.bsky.social or whatever that is. And then, we have our Patreon as well. If you wanted to join, you could also donate that money to wildfire victims because they probably need it more than we do. But yeah, thanks again. I'm glad that we we're able to get you guys on, and fan of the podcast. We like people who like to dive deep, not just deliver a bunch of hot takes.
That's what I'm here
That's
for.
what we use Patreon.
We do
episodes
both, balanced, asymmetrical but balanced.
for. That's true. I mean, you do have hot takes, but at least they are backed up with real thoughts instead of just trying to get clicks.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Thank you. I thought they were just backed up by like a lot of
I was talking about Jen
emotions
and Sarah, their podcast.
and opinions. Oh, okay. I was like, no, I'm just really opinionated. I'm not backing this up with anything.
I know.
Opinionated, passionate. We like to call it passionate. Yeah.
Brian's like, I know.
Of course, I know. We saw that Bob Dylan movie together. I know about all that passionate hot takes.
I feel bad for anybody that was in front of us. We talked too much during that movie. 2 drink minimum for that movie.
But some movies you just have to talk through. Like, there's just some of them where you're like, this has to come out right now.
It just cracked me. I couldn't help it. Like there were parts of it that I just couldn't hold it together. So that's my bad. Sorry, AMC at the shops at Orange.
No, we were both talking. It's a biopic. It's not like you're learning anything that you can't look up online.
Yeah, it was a Wikipedia biopic. You could probably figure it out.
Well, someone in front of you had
Anyway,
a great time.
I would have enjoyed that personally.
You
but
helped them get through that movie.
As they joke in a top 100, never go full Dylan.
we'll see.